All right, let's talk about one of the most dreaded questions from your medical school interview. How are you diverse and how are you going to add to the diversity of our class? Now, the reason medical schools ask this is because they want a good representation of different types of students in their class. But what people usually do wrong is they focus too much on things like race or ethnicity. Not that those aren't totally valid things to talk about in your diversity answer, but I think it's pretty limiting, especially for most candidates who maybe aren't part of an underrepresented group. So you want to think about the layers of diversity that you might bring and what those layers could be. So I usually talk about things like cultural diversity, of course, but also intellectual and experiential diversity. So you want to think about whether you majored or minored in something unusual in college, whether you were involved in any atypical activities, if maybe you just have some unusual hobbies, maybe you've been to some unusual places. It could also just be something in your lived experience or your background that most pre-meds wouldn't be able to claim during their interview. So it doesn't need to be ascribed statuses. It doesn't need to be the things that you were necessarily born with, but it can also be things that you've done or experienced. And that's actually probably going to be more interesting and more viable for you as a candidate for the most part. If you're part of a underrepresented group in medicine, like African Americans or Latinx people or people in the LGBTQ community, you can probably center your answer around that part of your identity because it will be very unusual and atypical for a pre-med. So let's get a little deeper about those three layers of diversity I was just talking about. So, with cultural diversity, I've already talked about some of those things being part of an underrepresented group, for example, but it could also just be maybe you're an immigrant, maybe you're the child of immigrants, maybe you practice a religion that might not be very common amongst pre-meds. It could just be organizations that you joined that had to do with culture and cultural exposure. So, even me, I'm a white guy from the Midwest, and I think I would also be able to claim that I have some cultural diversity based on the fact that I went to a lot of different religious schools growing up, even though I'm not religious. And I've been taught by Buddhists, I've been taught by secular Jews, I've been taught by Benedictine monks and Jesuit priests. And so I've learned a whole lot about religion and spirituality, even though it's not necessarily something that I practice, but I bring it as part of my identity and part of my perspective because I've been around it a lot with other people and I've been taught it a lot. So I think even if you feel like you're probably the most typical non-diverse person culturally, I think if you dig deep for what that word cultural actually means, you'll probably be able to come up with something. Now, with intellectual diversity, that's basically the diversity that's taken place in your academics or your scholarship. So again, maybe you minored in public health, or maybe something even more unusual, like you double majored in bio and, you know, psychology or art history or Spanish or something like that. If you have something in your academics that's different, you definitely want to bring that up. But it can also just be like something like a research project, where maybe you've studied something really unusual. I recall a student who did this travel research project where she went all across the South to, interview different people about their environment and their health factors. And so she did this unusual field work that was a pretty cool thing she could bring up for her intellectual diversity. So it's basically, have you studied or examined something to a greater extent than the average person? That's your intellectual diversity. Now, experiential diversity is kind of what it sounds like. It's about experience. It's, have you been exposed to something to a greater extent than another person probably has? So this could be greater exposure to a certain kind of patient population. Maybe that could be veterans or homeless people or autistic children or something like that. It can also just be the extent of exposure to a certain kind of condition, perhaps like HIV positive patients or the, people in palliative care who are elderly and terminal. There's a lot of different ways that you can discuss your experiences and your exposure, because you're not even saying that other people haven't seen or experienced those things at all. You're just making a point that you have an extra degree of exposure to that thing that gives you really valuable insights. And that's key in this whole equation is every time you talk about one of your layers of diversity, whether it's cultural, intellectual, or experiential, you want to end your discussion of each layer by explaining the ways that it's going to raise the awareness and the conscientiousness of those around you, whether that be patients or colleagues or classmates. The idea is you're trying to explain, here's why my perspective is valuable, here's what it's going to bring to the table and add to the conversation. So I want to now talk a little bit about the structure of your answer, and then I want to give you an example. Okay, the structure of the diversity answer is pretty simple. And I tried to set it up for you this way. I really want it to be talking about your cultural diversity, talking about your intellectual diversity, talking about your experiential diversity. And I want you to talk about them one at a time, because that's not only going to give you a great natural blueprint and structure for your answer, but it's also kind of going to have rhetorical power for the interviewer who's listening, because they'll be able to see the depth of your diverse perspectives. You won't just be bringing diversity in one way, but that power of three ways. And that has an underrated influence and effect on delivering a very convincing answer. So the structure is simple. You introduce the fact that you have layers of diversity with some kind of quick line about it. You discuss each layer of diversity one by one. And as I said before, you end the discussion of each by saying why it's an important perspective to bring to those around you. So I'm going to give an example now, and keep in mind that this is an example that's kind of ideal. I made it up myself. Some of it actually has to do with who I really am. Some of it doesn't at all. So you may not have something that is maybe this deep or this polished. You certainly may not be able to claim these three things that I'm about to talk about myself. But hopefully you can find three comparable things that fit each of these layers so that you can develop your own great diversity answer. So let me take a shot here at giving you my example. That's a great question. I think diversity is really important for a medical school class, and I may not bring traditional forms of diversity based on my culture and my family, but I do believe that my general educational background, my scholarship, and my lived experiences and exposures do bring a lot of diversity to the table. For one thing, I was educated by a lot of different types of people who come from different ideologies and religious backgrounds. Throughout my education, I was trained by Buddhist monks, secular Jews, Benedictine priests, Jesuit priests. So I learned a lot about all different kinds of things, dogma, scripture, meditation practices, the role of social justice in religion. I was exposed to a lot of different views on the meaning of life and our purpose for being here on earth. And I also learned a lot about how faith manifests differently in people's lives and how it actually can affect things that have to do with, health decisions, end of life decisions, the way that we view our bodies, the way that we view our health, the way that we want to take care of ourselves. All of that is often wrapped up in people's faith and their ideology. And I feel like because of my background and that wide exposure, I'll be able to make those around me more aware of how faith interacts with health and wellness. I think that'll be pretty important. And it'll also maybe let me relate to patients better, perhaps, depending on their backgrounds. I also studied public health in a lot of depth in college. I actually minored in it in addition to my normal major. And so I studied things like the Latin X paradox, the 11 state stroke belt, elevated diabetes in Native Americans. I studied a lot of these ways that environmental and social factors influence people's health and their health outcomes. And I really learned that you can't treat someone just based on their physical ailments in some kind of vacuum. You really need to consider a lot of these other things outside of the clinic that are going to influence their health literacy, their decisions, their compliance, their ability to pay or afford something. So I think this public health background will let me relate to patients better, maybe anticipate their needs a little bit better, since I might have more awareness of what's going on outside the clinic. It'll certainly help me look for those things when I'm talking to patients. And it'll also help me raise the awareness of my peers and my colleagues to help us understand the lives of our patients outside of the clinic. And then lastly, I've spent a lot of time as a crisis counselor on a suicide hotline. This was a very humbling, difficult experience. I fielded a lot of calls and texts from people who had suicidal ideation. They were going through domestic abuse or eating disorders or all kinds of, mental health crises. And so I learned strategies of de-escalation. I learned again how something like mental health can manifest below the surface and in ways that don't necessarily have to do with physical health. And I just gained a lot of sensitivity and empathy and attunement to the things that people might be going through, how to talk to them in a way that validates them and doesn't condescend and makes them feel welcomed and safe. And I think this exposure to mental health is just a third really valuable way that I can bring a diverse perspective to your class and help others be more aware of how to deal with mental health issues, whether themselves or helping their patients. And these are all ways that I think I can add to the diversity at your school. And I would also really look forward to learning a lot from my peers because I know that they're also going to have amazing experiences and great insights that I might not have as much awareness of. And so I think that's the whole point. We can all enrich each other and make it a more collaborative, overall more aware learning environment. Okay, so that was kind of off the cuff and maybe a little long, but that's how you want to do your answer, in my opinion, is, everybody has one element of diversity that falls into all these categories. So you just got to brainstorm and dig deep and figure out what your three layers are going to be, and then just formulate your answer and make sure you have a way that you can explain why it's important to those around you. I think if you do this, you'll be able to overcome this dreaded, difficult diversity question at your interview. Best of luck.